Tomorrow it will be 24 years since I made profession in the order, and therefore it must be the feast of St. Matthew. And so indeed it is. And it strikes me as perhaps instructive to consider why it is that St. Matthew, alone of the evangelists, records this parable of Jesus. He didn't need to. There's plenty of other stuff he could have used about how the last are first and the first are last. Why did this parable in particular appeal to him? And I wonder whether it has something to do with St. Matthew's personal story. You'll recall that he was a tax collector who repented and had Jesus for dinner, and the Pharisees then got rather snotty about it. St. Matthew responded to the urgency of Christ's appeal on that first meeting with him. Come, follow me. And in doing so, he put himself outside of political society. He rebelled against the political society to which he belonged. The society not of the Romans, because he was almost certainly not a Roman, but a Herodian tax collector. And Herod had a legitimate claim, possibly, as king of the Jews. He was builder of the temple. And as any provincial bursar will tell you, taxes may be unpopular, but they are necessary. Yet, in the eyes of the Pharisees, this man was already beyond the pale. An outsider as far as the Pharisees are concerned, outside the boundaries of the community. And there's plenty in St. Matthew's Gospel about Christ's disputes with the Pharisees. Some will tell you that this is because the early church, or the so-called Matthean community, was in dispute with the successors of the Pharisees, the rabbis. There is an enormous amount wrong with that claim. And one of the things that's wrong with it is that it supposes that St. Matthew is simply retrojecting his history, his community's history, into the life of Jesus. I think what's true is that from the beginning, during Christ's own life, St. Matthew realized that Jesus was setting up an alternative community, an alternative to the Israel defined by Pharisaism. And it is we who are that alternative community, we, the church. Or rather, not an alternative, but the fulfillment of the community of Israel. We are the vineyard of the Lord as the day of harvest is dawning. So St. Matthew identifies himself, I think, with those who come at the 11th hour. There's a strong sense running through his gospel in particular of that 11th hour, of urgency. The end is coming. There is no time to waste. And today we are invited to hold on to that same sense of urgency, of God's call to us, of the need for us to make that call heard in the world before it is too late. But what comes with that sense of urgency in today's parable is a sense of immense privilege. The workers who came at the 11th hour got lucky. They were employed by a master whose delight in goodness and generosity outweighs any human sense of strict justice. And surely St. Matthew had the same sense of an extraordinary and utterly undeserved blessing. It was quite unexpected, quite unlooked for when Christ told him to follow, when the mercy of God visited him and invited him to join in the harvest of God's vineyard. And at that moment, though it did not look like it, St. Matthew, who had been an outsider, became an insider. Maybe he was outside the political system of Herod and the Romans. Maybe he was outside the social system of the scribes and the Pharisees, but he was inside the one community that matters, the laborers in the vineyard. And he was inside not through his own abilities or through his own merit, but through the forgiveness of God, which he experienced that day in Jesus Christ. a privilege utterly undeserved. I've always wondered why the 11th hour workers had not previously been hired. They give something of a laconic answer: because no one has hired us. Why not? Why had they not gone elsewhere? Why had they not got on their bikes and looked for work? Were they too weak? Were they too feckless? Did St. Matthew look back at his own spiritual fecklessness, his own spiritual weakness, and recognize that it was despite that he'd not only been called to follow Christ, but called to write the first gospel, a gospel which expresses the extraordinary reversal worked by the mercy of God in Jesus Christ. But there is something even more remarkable than that at work in today's parable. You see, a parable is only ever a partial comparison, a partial analogy, because it's about the kingdom of heaven. A vineyard needs laborers, but God's kingdom doesn't. God doesn't need any help from us. He doesn't need it, and yet throughout human history, from the first hour of creation with Adam and Eve until the last hour of creation, which is today, God has been inviting human beings to share in his creative work, to tend his beloved vineyard. And the reward is not just a single denarius. The fruits of this harvest are to become for us here today the spiritual drink of the heavenly banquet. We who know this know that we are not servants working for a wage, but friends called to his supper, friends who receive freely. We sing, therefore, as we reap. The joy of taking part in the harvest, if it is the harvest of God's vineyard, is its own reward. And that joy itself is only a foretaste and promise of the reward to come. So the parable of the laborers in the vineyard is first of all about God's insistent forgiveness. He comes looking for us all the time. Even at the 11th hour, he invites us into his vineyard, his community, his church. Just as he came looking for St. Matthew, who loved this parable, so he comes now looking for us at this 11th hour. And we have responded, and here we are. Let us pray that God will still find us laboring in his vineyard when the day is over, so that we can enjoy forever the inexpressible delights that await us, wholly unearned, when we enter into God's rest.